Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the session today, Meet the Scholars. We have two prominent scholars, Professor Hashim Kamali and also Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf. We are very delighted to have Imam Feisal here, and we take the opportunity with his presence here in Malaysia this time. I think he's here just for a couple of weeks, I suppose, and he's leaving back next week, I suppose, or this weekend, Sunday. And Ramadan Kareem, I think today is it 25th day of Ramadan? I'm not counting the days. I don't know, I think 25th. Huh? It's the 25th day of Ramadan. We are very fortunate to have the Ramadan this year, and we are approaching the end of Ramadan. And in Malaysia, the mood is not Ramadan anymore, it's the Hari Raya mood. And today, Imam Faisal look more Malay than me because he's with baju Melayu. And, Alhamdulillah, for Imam Faisal, for your presence here in IS, and I think we will be having two discussions, one from Prof. Kamali and followed by Imam Faisal. We will begin with Prof. Hashim Kamali, who will be talking on the Maqasid narrative development so far, followed by Imam Faisal on the need for a fiqh for Muslim minorities in Western communities.
Welcome everyone. Indeed, I am happy also to welcome a friend and someone who has been here with us before, but each time he comes, due to our long-standing friendship, I get to know that one way or another that he is here. And I invited him, and he very kindly accepted to be here with us today. I will discuss the Maqasid narrative. I think the Maqasid is a long story, longer than I can summarize in a short time that is allocated to me today. But I think the Maqasid are divided into five phases that I will name them briefly, but then will later discuss them in some detail. The five phases that I have listed for Maqasid are the first phase was history and contributions of scholars like Al-Juwayni, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Shatibi, and later contemporary scholars, Al-Qaradawi, Bin Bayya, and others. And the second phase was epistemological, the kind of probing into the methodology of the Maqasid, the definition, types and conditions, and identification of Maqasid. And the third phase was evaluative. We began to use the Maqasid as a tool by which to correct some of the earlier interpretation of the sources and ideas. Also the encounter between the Maqasid and the Usul al-Fiqh. There seemed to be a kind of overlap and tension between these two. There shouldn't be, but this has been how it was seen. And the fourth phase was the implementation phase in Islamic banking, in finance, in family law, in governance, even in science and other fields. And the interest is continuing in the implementation of Maqasid. It has become almost as if it's a replacement to Sharia itself. Maqasid are being used, sometimes in a superficial way. And this is the fifth phase, the kind of excess in the uses and abuses of maqasid. Anyone who likes an idea, they mention the maqasid and throws it. But I think that this is becoming a kind of a cliche. And having mentioned these 5 phases, I will go back to the beginning. The maqasid, the meaning is, of course, also in Malay, maqsad, maqsud, purpose, what someone intends to achieve, not necessarily even in the present, but even in the future. Sometimes the difference between illa and maqsad is, and I have written about this, that the illa is a status quo, referred to status quo ante, something that existed in the past and exists now, but this is like there must be a hukum in the sources, and then you begin to find the illa for that hukum, and then you construct an analogy or something like this. So the illa does not look into the future, whereas maqsad is not confined to status quo, the present status quo. It looks into both directions. The maqasid are in a way a victim of historical neglect, partly because of this, that the maqasid somehow converges with philosophy. What is the purpose of this and that? What is the purpose of the lawgiver for validating this hukum? And if you look into the purposes of the ahkam, and this is the purpose, we will be discussing this, and then there might be a time that you don't understand the purpose of the hukum, and you then begin that some of the ahkam that you don't understand, you may say, well, I don't accept this and that. That engaging in the purpose philosophy of the ahkam has somehow been seen by the fuqaha and ulama of usul al-fiqh as a kind of divergence from the spirit of submissiveness. We are supposed to take the ahkam of Sharia on their face value and follow them, not to look and dig into their underlying meaning and purposes. But that is again a misstatement. The Sharia has to be understood in order for us to be able to apply it in a meaningful way and to extend it to similar situations. But the ulama of the past did not choose to see it in this positive light, but in the negative light, that if you begin to engage in the underlying purposes of the ahkam, then you also engage in some kind of departure from the spirit of submissiveness. And this historical neglect continued right till 20th century. Until the 1980s, it was a kind of a word that people would deliberately avoid. But then a renewed interest began to develop quite rapidly into the maqasid. And that is where we begin in the 5 phases that I referred to, have developed quite rapidly, from exploring into the beginning of maqasid, reaching to the abuses and excessive uses of maqasid within the pace of a few decades. And within when the pace of development becomes so fast, and then ideas begin to kind of, sometimes diverge from their correct kind of natural course of development. We have seen some of this in the Maqasid. This was the kind of partly part of this tension was that the ulama of Usul al-Fiqh is focused on reading the text, interpreting and understanding the text from the words and sentences of the text. This is the literalist engagement of Islamic juristic thought and tafsir. They stick to the text, in the word of the text, in the meaning, haqiqi, in literal meaning, and they avoid engagement in these, purposes and philosophy and so on. So this was the difference between the Maqasid and the Usul. In the Usul al-Fiqh dominated history of Islamic juristic thought. But then that had become problematic. And that is why problematic, because much of the fiqh has developed in medieval times. In the realities of contemporary development, whether it is in the area of government or economics or finance and so on, we are fast departing from all those understandings of the fiqh kind of formulas. But when you mention the maqasid purposes, it's futuristic. It relates to the present as well as to the purpose. Everything has a purpose, whatever you do. And that is the versatility of the maqasid, that we can relate it to our needs and to our purposes in a way that is also meaningful and in line with the spirit of the Quran and the sources. As soon as you mention the daruriyat, the necessity, the essential, protection of life, protection of family, protection of property, protection of rationality, of religion, these are dynamic ideas relevant to our existence today. And I think then other discussions of the maqasid brings to light the kind of the ease and its relevance, how people can easily relate the maqasid to their line of research, to their purposes. And why was there such a neglect? The Al-Shatibi, historically speaking, was the first scholar who developed the maqasid into a separate chapter of the Sharia. And Al-Shatibi died in 790 Hijrah, that is end of about 8th century. The Usul al-Fiqh developed in the 2nd and 3rd century Hijrah. The mazahib developed during that time, and there was a lag of 5 centuries before someone came and introduced this as a new chapter of the Sharia. Why? Because the origins of the maqasid were there in the Quran, in Sunnah. The Quran is replete with explanation of its own objectives and purposes, not just the do's and don'ts of the ahkam, but what is the benefit of this, what is the harm of this, the kind of reason behind this, the persuasive aspect of appeal to the psychology, to the reason of. These are also maqasidi kind of approaches. If you look at the Quran, rahmah is one of the overriding objectives of Islam, compassion and mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called himself by those names, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, and the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, and the Quran itself, هُدًى وَرَحْمَةً لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Rahmah becomes the governing principle of Islam, and so is justice. The Quran is, again, The Quran refers to so many places to the value of truth and amana, and justice, fulfillment of promises, moral virtue. All of these are the maqasid. But then when you come to the juristic treatment of the maqasid, from Al-Juwayni, then his disciple Al-Ghazali, they tell us that the maqasid are five, as I mentioned earlier, the daruriyat of the maqasid. Maqasid were divided into three categories: daruriyat, hajiyat. Hajiyat, these are not essential for life, but they are supplementary to the essentials. And then tahsiniyat, the desirability. Then they began to define the daruriyat, this five types. Al-Qarafi, the Maliki jurist, had one sixth type, that is personal honor or ird. And then we stayed with that. Even Al-Qarafi's addition is often ignored. But then came Ibn Taymiyyah. He asked this relevant question: why do we confine the maqasid to five categories? Do you look at the Quran? And he mentions these: sidq, and amana, and adl, and truth, wafa bil ahad. Are they also not the purposes and objectives of Sharia? Therefore, we do not confine the daruriyat to only a number. And then that became mainstream nowadays in our times, like Al-Qaradawi, bin Bayya, Ibn Ashur, and others. They have accepted openly the idea that justice, hurriyat, for example, world peace, and economic development, as I say, scientific research, our standing, in the international community, the Ummah's dignity and standing depends on a scientific advancement. So I think that this idea that the maqasid are more dynamic, they cannot be confined to a few types or categories, is now more or less accepted in the openness that we apply maqasid in so many different capacities is already indicative of this open acceptance of the maqasid. But there are certain aspects of the maqasid that are neglected. One is the relationship between the maqasid and the wasa'il. The Sharia is divided into two divisions: the purposes and the means towards reaching that purpose. It is the correct identification of the wasa'il in relationship to particular maqasid that completes the meaning of the maqsad or purpose. If you are excessive in your identification of the means by which to realize a maqsad, or you are manipulating the means for a particular purpose, like nowadays we see in Islamic banking and finance, they are all full of hila. You know, it's manipulation. You apply aina, just disguised to riba. You apply murabaha and buy bisaman ajil as the same way. Paper transaction, just a means to quick, profit. And this, you cannot really say that it is murabaha or buy bisaman ajil the way that they were understood by the fuqaha, because both of them are trading means of trading, not financialization. Now we have basically left, this is a sale and purchase, whether one type or the other, murabaha by Bisaman Ajil, and other their sales and purchases is a trade, not financialization the way that the banks are applying it. This is the kind of when here is an excess and distortion in the means to a particular purpose. The purpose here, they want to apply the Sharia finance in the correct way. But the means that they choose depart them from that correct path. This is a kind of, when you look at the relationship between the maqasid and the wasa'il, you find that there is a lot of abuse of the maqasid, and you need to go further into this. The means and the purpose, the maqasid and the wasa'il are sometimes identified both in the text, the Quran, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, but otherwise through ijtihad. When you read in the Quran, Ya ayyuhal lazina amanu, إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه. When you deal in future transaction in dain, then write it down, document it. Now, the purpose is hifz al-mal. Hifz al-mal, that is, that your money is protected. And the way to that, the wasila to that is to write it down. This is where in the Quran, both the purpose and the means is given. In the Sunnah, khiyar al-shart. Khiyar al-shart, buyer and seller, the buyer may say, I'll ratify this contract in 2 or 3 days' time. The purpose is to that he is not forced to do this out of ignorance, that the integrity of his consent is not compromised. And here khiyar al-aib, khiyar al-shart is used as a means to protect the purpose. The purpose is the integrity of consent. So here in Sunnah, both you find the maqsad and, but this is not often the case. The maqasid in the wasa'il, sometimes one or sometimes both, are identified through ijtihad. Through ijtihad, sometimes in ijtihad is not always accurate. Error can be made. And a definition for the maqasid actually waited until Ibn Ashur, 1970s. No one gave a definition. And the rest of the methodology of the maqasid also did not develop for a very long time. By methodology, we mean definition, we mean the conditions, we mean the essential conditions or the supplementary condition, the arkan and the shurut, and the ways that maqasid are identified, that is the masalik al-maqasid, and the types of the maqasid, and so on, like the maqasid are 3 or 6 types, zwanni and qat'i. Qat'i maqasid and zwanni maqasid, decisive and speculative. Those that are identified by the clear text, or those that are identified by ijtihad, one can be zwanni, the other is qat'i. Then maqasid asli, maqasid tab'i. Maqasid asli are the primary maqasid that are found in the sources. What is the purpose of ilm? Begin the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowledge of religion, but tabi is knowledge of the world affairs and so on. Maqasid al-shari, maqasid al-mukallaf. Maqasid al-shari, of the lawgiver's maqasid, is again, say, education, certain maqasid. But I may be doing some kind of education in order to get a diploma and get a job. This is the maqsad of the mukallaf of the same. So the typology of the maqasid. Ibn Ashur developed the conditions of the maqasid, that it must be sabit, it must be zahir, it must be am, it must be tward. Sabit, that it is established, it is not disputed and subject to disagreement. Zahir, that it is not a hidden factor. Maqsad, you must know what is the maqsad of purpose of a contract. And am, that it applies wherever it is supposed to apply. And tward, that it is exclusive of what does not belong to it. These are the kind of the methodological development of the maqasid that you have. Then we have other contributions to the maqasid that goes into its application, the aspects. Nowadays we apply maqasid in Islamic banking and finance, and I wrote and I asked the question. There are 5 or 6 contracts. Murabaha, by bisaman ajil, mudaraba, musharaka, this and that. We are talking of maqasid, but have we looked into what is the specifically or more generally the maqsad of each of these contracts? What is the maqsad of by murabaha or by bisaman ajil, or what is the primary purpose, what is the secondary purpose, what is this and that? These are questions that are not answered even in Islamic banking and finance. What is the primary purpose of these contracts? Unless you have those, you will not have the tool by which to say that, yes, this contract is properly applied in accordance with this maqsad, or it's not properly applied. But then to generally say, yes, this is proper, this is not proper, without knowing, identifying the definition of that particular subject you're talking about, then you fall into speculative engagement. This is what we are a lot of the times in Islamic banking and finance. I think you are the kind of fresh focus that we find, revival of the maqasid, is now taking us to science, is now taking us to Islamic economics and to contracts and a lot of areas. So I think that now you can see better the kind of the 5 phases that I said. The first phase was historical. The second phase was epistemological, knowledge-based development, methodology, and there's 5 phases. But the weakness of the maqasid that still remains with us is in methodology. Like the usul al-fiqh is so rich methodologically, the usul al-fiqh, the purpose of the usul al-fiqh is to help the correct exercise of ijtihad. And ijtihad can be conducted in so many ways, whether it is through istihsan or through qiyas or through istishab or sadd al-zara'i and so on. And each of these has its own definition, conditions and so on, quite well developed in terms of methodology, the usul al-fiqh. That is not the case with regard to the maqasid. We have done some work, and it is work in progress. But when we have a correct and full methodological tools for the maqasid, we will be able to take the maqasid out of the realm of this value judgment. Anyone who likes an idea says, oh, this is the maqasid. We cannot do that if we can measure the accuracy or otherwise of what we say by correct methodology. This is where we have not really completed this work, and it is still work in progress, the weakness of the methodology. Okay, I thank you very much. I think I will not take any more time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Prof. Kamali. I think it is, it's quite difficult for Prof. Kamali to, the subject matter will take is if you are studying in university, it will take 1 semester or 2 semesters, and now you to comprise it into 20 to 30 minutes. It's not an easy task, but I think from the discussion from Prof. Kamali, I think especially with regard to the implementation and evaluation, perhaps you may have some questions, and please reserve your questions afterwards. Next, I would like to invite Imam Feisal to discuss on the need for the fiqh for Muslim minorities in Western communities.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. My dear brother, Professor Hashim Kamali, my Bapa Ibu sekalian, as we say. Assalamu alaikum and selamat bulan puasa. It's a pleasure to be here again with you, and I was surprised that actually many of you came in this time of fasting when we all feel spaced out and intellectually less capable of absorbing as when we are able to eat. But thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me to this August assembly. As many of you know, I grew up in Malaysia. I lived 10 years of my life in Malaysia. I'm an old boy of the Victoria Institution. I went to New York when I was 17, and I've been in New York now for over 50 years, from 1965. My father was sent after being here, after being the first principal of College Islam and Klang and the first head of the Department of Islamic Studies, University of Malaya. And later on, he came to be the first director of the UIA. So he was in New York and in Washington, D.C. as Imam and director of the Islamic centers there. So I had a front row seat to the evolution of Islam in America. And in the process, I see that in some ways, every community that goes and starts itself in a new society as a Muslim minority, whether it was the Ethiopians at the time of the Prophet, when the Prophet sent some of his companions to Ethiopia for protection, is the first time of a Muslim minority in a non-Muslim majority society. And as I was telling Professor Kamali earlier, that the narrative of a small community that initiates itself in a majority non-Muslim society is actually something which has always begun in our part of our history. Even the first Muslims who came to Malaya in the time of Parameswara, when he became a Muslim, I mean, we were all Muslim minorities at one stage of our historical narrative. So while we benefit from the history and the development of our religion as a community, as a jurisprudence, as systems of law, as madhabs of law, and the history in the evolution of our jurisprudence as well, there's also some aspect in which we feel we are starting all over again, and this creates a challenge, because the challenge is how to maintain the freshness of the faith and the relevance of the faith in a society which is different. And I've observed that there's a particular narrative which happens in every society and even different religions, is that when a particular religion migrates, so let's say when Islam migrates from the Hijaz to Egypt, and later on to North Africa and the rest of Africa, the south to Yemen, the north to what was Byzantium, the east to what is now Iran, and then later India and Malaysia and so forth. It took a while for the Aqidah of Islam to translate itself into the cultural forms of that society. And by culture, I mean not just culture, the jurisprudence, the customs, the art forms of that particular culture. So if you look, for example, at the form of qawwali music in India. It's a very Indian sound. And if you look at the religious songs of Egypt, it's a very Egyptian sound. And I had the occasion once to hear the Sufi chants of some Turkish Sufi orders. And I happened to visit a monastery in Mount Athos in Greece, and they were singing the same exact tunes. It was the same exact musical forms that the priests were singing in their chants and the Muslim Sufis were singing in their chants in Turkey and this in Greece. And I was fascinated by the fact that the musical form was actually the same musical rhythm you could hear. So, for example, in the case of Malaya, it was in the 1400s, I believe, when Parameswara became Muslim. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and what do we have? When I was a young boy in Malaysia, when a Chinese or any person became a Muslim, Malay or Indian, whatever, they wouldn't say Masuk Islam. They said Masuk Melayu. He became a Malay. What was the journey? What was the narrative from the time that Parameswara became a Muslim for the Malays to think that being a Muslim was equal to being a Malay? That journey is the journey that we're trying to recapitulate in the West. In every Muslim majority country you go to, the population does not think of Islam as an Arab religion. Turks think of it as a Turkish religion. Egyptians think of Islam as an Egyptian religion. Afghans, I'm sure, probably think of Islam as an Afghani religion. Malays think of it as a Malay religion. But this identification is a journey. And therefore, what we need to do in America, in the West, is to make Islam an American religion. It means we have to translate it into the American form in the culture, in law, in jurisprudence, in art, in architecture. In fact, many of the forms that we think today are Islamic architectural forms were the forms that the Christians used. The Hagia Sophia, which is the big mosque in Istanbul, was actually a cathedral. It was begun, I think, 30 years before the Prophet was born. The architectural form of the dome was something that the Muslims adopted from other cultures. But now it has become so identified as being Islamic. Well, it's not in the Quran. It's not, the Prophet's mosque didn't have a dome originally. They didn't have a steeple. We have a minaret now, which is equivalent to the steeple to call the people to pray. So you see that many things that we think are Islamic are actually universal, things that belong to other people. But what has happened in our jurisprudence is that whenever the custom of a people is not contradictory to the ahkam of the Sharia, of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, it is deemed Shari, and is not contradictory to the Sharia. So, for example, in Malaysia, before independence, when the sultans were the power, you had the Quran, you had the Hadith. The law was the Quran, the Hadith, the firman of the Sultan, and Adat Melayu, the Ada of the Malay people. Adat, because Ada has the force of law when it is not contradicted by the ahkam of the Sharia. So, what we are trying to do, and what I think is what will naturally happen, what has naturally happened in all Muslim societies, when you see Islam as it evolved in Egypt, in North Africa, in Central Asia, in Turkey, in the Yemen, in Southeast Asia, in Iran, etc., is that it translated itself into the cultural forms of the society, and as the Ummah began to expand from the Hijaz in our history, there was no madhabs in the beginning. The differences in opinion among the scholars be crystallized into the different madhabs, as you very well know. And even within different regions, and different times, A particular madhab may even bifurcated. So you have the Hanafi madhab, for example, in India, the Hanafi madhab at the time of in Ottoman Turkey, you would see some differentiation. And then after the introduction of the Majalla and the interaction with Europe and so forth, and the concept of a nation state and different modern developments, you see also a further evolution in the madhab of the Ottoman Turkey, of the Hanafi madhab as applied in that region. So here we are, starting afresh as a small community, a minority in a country like the United States. And my particular issue, because I'm not a professional academic, I deal with people who have real issues. People come to me with problems and they want solutions. A woman comes to me and says, I want to marry this young man. My brother, who's a Muslim, is allowed to marry a Kitabi woman without forcing her, requiring her to become a Muslim. There's no, the supply of Muslim men is getting less for us. We want to get married. Now I have this guy, he loves me, he cares for me. Why do I have to force him when my brother doesn't have to force his Kitabi wife to become a Muslim? What do we do? The reason why a lot of people come to me is that many traditional Islamic centers say, sorry, I can't do it, this is the rule, run from my office. What we have discovered is that if you treat people that way, what will happen? They go to the courthouse, they can get a civil marriage, they're going to get married anyway. You lose them to the community. So this is not what Christians call ministering to the needs of your community. We need to minister to the needs of the community. And it is always the human need which dictates something. Even the history of the revelation, when there was a need, a revelation would come. So there is, in fact, a discourse, an interaction in the very dynamics of the revelation of the Quran, of the engagement between human need and what is right, the right decision. And what we have learned, what I have learned, and many of us learn in our lives, is that the right decision is not always universally right. What is right can be right in this place and not in that place. In this context and not in another context. It can be right today for you, and tomorrow it's no longer right. You know, that famous song of, what is it, Earth, Wind and Fire? After the love is gone, what used to be right is wrong. So even the concept of sometimes, if the Prophet's ahkam, as has been mentioned by some of our scholars, the Prophet, apparently a young man once came and asked the Prophet, can I kiss my wife when I'm fasting? He said, no. And an older man came and asked the same question. The Prophet said, yes. He said, why do you give a different hukm for this person, not for me? He said, because you will not stop at just kissing. Okay? So when we look at contexts, how do we make the right decision in a particular context that lead people? So what we have come up is we're developing a methodology, an approach. We counsel the couple. We walk them through their feelings of love for each other. We say we create what Ibn Arabi calls creative imagination. Okay? We say, okay, let's say you are married. How observant are you of your fasting? Do you pray? Do you fast? Do you get up for suhoor? What will you feel like if your husband doesn't get up for suhoor with you and you have suhoor alone? How will you feel? How will you feel? And we ask both of them, not only just the Muslim party. We ask each side. We walk them through what we have learned are the issues which couples face as their life unfolds. How will you feel if your husband or your wife wants to take your child to the church Sunday school? How would you feel if your wife wants to take your children to a Muslim Sunday school? As you walk, we have walked couples through this exercise, and the majority of cases, they think about it, they say, I have no problem with this, I'm willing to, and depending upon the relative religiosity of the parties, sometimes we have a woman who say, you know what, listen, you want me? I'm a Muslim, you have to become Muslim, otherwise forget about me. That's an easy situation. But when they're not very practicing, and what happens also is that people who very often are not practicing, after they get married and after they have children, they change. I know many guys who used to be like, womanizers and whatever, and once they get married and have children, they want their children to be very, very different than they were in terms of their behavior. So we're recognizing this, we walk people through these things, and then we say, okay, fine. And in several instances, actually, the couple came to me and said, after thinking about it, we've decided we're not going to get married. Because they realized that, they could not make it work. But for those who go through this exercise, we've realized that we'll be able to make it work. And it's about giving people as the Malays say, cari jalan, an approach, a workable approach that is gratifying to the human need. Because the human being, regardless of what religion they claim they are, have a longing for God. And the maqsad of all religion, at the end of the day, is connection with God. To connect the individual with God. And everybody seeks that connection. Everybody longs for that connection. And our spiritual teachers, our spiritual masters have shown us and have been, their major contribution was teaching people to connect to God. And even in my interfaith lectures, I've discovered that when you help people connect to God, they feel something. So that's the primary overall maqsad of everything. Is to, as Professor Kamali was just saying, I was thinking that, when Allah tells us, He commands us to fast this month, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So gaining taqwa is the maqsad of our fasting. And you all know the hadith of the Prophet where he said, many a person fasts and gains nothing but from their fast but hunger and thirst. And many person does the qiyam al-layl and gets nothing from their prayers but just fatigue. They get tired. So this hadith teach us not only why we fast, but the importance of ensuring that we are not among those who all we get from our fast is just hunger and thirst. Now, how do we test that we have gained in taqwa? I studied physics, and so in science we have taught you have to test something. Because if you can't test something, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. You cannot even prove that it exists. If you cannot measure something, you cannot even prove that it exists. So if you cannot measure your taqwa, you cannot prove that you have taqwa. And the famous management guru, Peter Drucker, I think, said, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. We need to manage our taqwa. We need to manage our faith. We need to manage the criteria by which we determine and measure the degree of our religiosity and the measure of our Islamicity or of our Islamicness, if you can call it that. So it is from that kind of an approach that we minister to our community. Because if you don't relate to them, if you don't draw them towards the remembrance of Allah, then it's all just external. It's all just, like Islam without Iman. So, in our deliberations, and I've had discourses with many people, colleagues of ours like Jasir Auda and a friend of mine who used to be the judge of the District of Jerusalem in what is on the Israeli-controlled side, have had interesting discourses about this issue, because in the case of, we actually co-authored a book about Fiqh al-Aqaliyat, applying how the Palestinians in Israel, who are 20% of the Israeli population, are applying Fiqh al-Aqaliyat in their particular context. That context is particularly interesting because the Israeli judiciary recognizes Sharia law as applicable for personal status law for Palestinians, and have actually established Sharia courts all over Israel for the Muslim inhabitants. And their decisions are enforceable by the Israeli government. But that was a fascinating history, because they were once a majority and they became a minority. But how they're a minority in a non-Muslim majority applies to us, and in how we can apply lessons from what they have done, what our counterparts in England have done, to integrate their ability to apply Sharia law in their personal status law and have it endorsed by the government of England, so that it's enforceable, are the kinds of things that we're looking at right now in the United States. It's happening right now in a kind of a wild way, in a haphazard way, not in a planned, controlled way. It would be nice, and my dream is that we could actually do that in a planned, controlled manner. But there's a parallel subject to what I was talking earlier in terms of trying to establish a root of a dynamic sense of faith in our community, because that is the part which is always the driver of the law and the jurisprudence later. I mean, the purpose of the law is to establish. I mean, what's interesting is that the word deen, as you know, can mean both law and religion. When Sayyidina Yusuf, in Surah Yusuf said he could not take his brother fi din al-Malik. So it is not the religion of the king of Egypt. It is the law of the king of Egypt, and without having him accused of having stolen the king's drinking cup. So for us, deen is both religion and law. It is the covenant, the contract that we have between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the root of the law has to be something spiritually dynamic. And for us, that's a primary imperative. That is the basis on which we establish both our faith, what attracts our faith and draws people to it, both within our community and from outside our community. And in fact, we're on the verge of launching a notion of a community of faith. Just allow me just 1-2 more minutes to just close with a little introduction about that. And that is that in the Quran, as many of you know, Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah tells the nomadic Arabs, قَالَتِ الْأَعْرَابُ آمَنَّا. Allah tells the Prophet, قُلْ لَمْ تُؤْمِنُوا وَلَكِنْ قُولُوا أَسْلَمْنَا فَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ. The Bedouin Arabs say that we have become believers. And Allah says, tell them, no, you have not yet believed. But you can say we have become Muslims, aslamna, we have surrendered, because Iman has not yet penetrated into your hearts. I believe that the Muslims in the last 30, 40 years, several decades, have overemphasized Islam and underemphasized Iman. We have overemphasized the Islamization of this and of that and whatever, Islamization of states, Islamization of knowledge, Islamization of everything. And, the result is the Islamized terrorism also. But we have completely ignored Iman. And this, to me, I think, is something which needs to be rectified. Why the focus on an Islamic state? Why not an Imanic state? Why, if Allah says Iman has not penetrated, if you're a Muslim without Iman, what are you? We are in effect faithless Muslims. It sounds different in English, It sounds more effective than in Arabic, A Muslim min ghair iman or yani. But a faithless Muslim is what many Muslims are. And I believe that that's not enough. Iman is essential. And I remember asking scholars, how come we call ourselves Muslims when Allah never once calls the followers of the Prophet, Ya ayyuhalladhina aslamu? Always, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. Or qul lil mu'minin. Not once in the Quran does Allah, and I looked, call the Prophet's followers, oh you Muslims, wahai orang yang berislam. It's always wahai orang yang beriman, in every single case. And after the Prophet's death, his successors were called Amirul Mu'mineen, not Amirul Muslimin. I remember asking lots of scholars, how come we call ourselves Muslims and not Mu'mins? Especially given the critique that Allah makes of the nomadic Arabs, the Bedouin Arabs. I've never found a satisfactory answer to this until I read a recent book called Muhammad and the Believers, which he traces the change of the followers of the nomenclature of Mu'min to Muslims in the first century after the Prophet's death. But the historical academic research is one issue. More relevant to me is why aren't we fixing it ourselves? I mean, to be a Mu'min is so much more important that in Mu'min is one of Allah's 99 names. Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, Al-Salam, Al-Mu'min is one of Allah's names. Muslim is not one of his names. So I'm asking questions here more than I have tried to develop my own answers, but I believe this is the quest. The quest is the quest that I have put over my community right now, or my congregation, is we want to launch a group of people who focus on being mu'mins. Yes, we are Muslim, but Iman is the primary issue. How do you educate a mu'min? Educating Muslim is very easy. There's so many Islamic schools. Learn how to pray, learn how to fast, learn this, memorize the surahs, It's give a 5-year-old an iPad and he will teach himself how to be a Muslim. But how to be a mu'min? How do you teach a person to be a mu'min? And you all know the famous hadith of Jibril, as it's called, where one day a person came and asked the Prophet, what is Islam? What is Iman? What is Ihsan? You all know this hadith, right? And then at the end of the Prophet says, this was my brother Jibril who came to teach you your deen. So this means then that our deen is not just Islam. Our deen is Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. If we just focus on Islam, we are 1/3 of Allah's deen. Maybe 1/3, because the others are qualitatively different. And that to be a muhsin is to worship Allah as if you see Allah. And if not, with the conviction that Allah is watching you and seeing you. It's this quality of shahada, the quality of witnessing, the quality of what our spiritual masters call hudur, being present with Allah. And when we're present with Allah like that, our religion takes on a whole different complexion. Our personalities take on a different complexion. The way we interact with people takes on a different complexion. The way we interact with animals and animals interact with us takes a different complexion. The way we interact with creation takes on a different complexion. Because now then, we are people who have upheld the amanah that Allah said He offered to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, and they refused it, and we assumed it. So our work is around that. What is this amanah? How do we teach our children what this amanah is? How do we make sure we discharge this amanah individually and collectively? Allah says He's created us as His Khalifas on earth. What's meant to be God's Khalifa on earth? How do we become Khalifas on earth? I was just rereading a section of Ibn Arabi's book by Izutsu, where Ibn Arabi differentiates between the human being as insan and the human being as bashar. As insan, we're all equal. But as bashar, we are human in the weak sense. It's a sense of our bashariyah that we have control over each other and compete with each other. But at the level of insan, we are all equal. So we need to practice our lives, our religion, from the approach of our insaniyah, our insanness, not from our bashariness. And if once you are able to distinguish between these traits, you can actually differentiate between a person who is practicing his faith or doing anything from apart from his bashariyah as opposed to from his insaniyah. It is from the insaniyah approach that we fulfill our khilafah and the amanah that Allah has placed upon us. I apologize if I diverged somewhat from the discussion on the specifics of a fiqh, but this is the basis of a fiqh. It has to come from this fiqh fi din that is the source of all of this. Because if the fiqh is not about bringing us to the remembrance of Allah, as Allah says, "Wala dhikrullahi akbar," then I think we have missed the target and the objective. And in the context of this month of Bulan Suci Ramadan ini, this noble and holy month of Ramadan, it is good for us to remind ourselves the reason why Allah created us, to be grateful for having created us, and to be grateful to have had the opportunity to worship Him and to fast Him from this insaniyah approach. Thank you very much. May God bless you all. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I've given, quite an important question, and perhaps that will be taken up by the audience. And I think it reminds us to stories by Muhammad Abdul, and I think even Muslim scholars who visited Western countries, Europe or even Japan, where they say, I saw Islam here, but when I saw Islam but not Muslims. Maybe the word mu'min should be there to incorporate that. And that would be something that I think we need to talk about these three component important thing, when the concentration nowadays is basically on the fiqh perspective rather than the holistic one. I think I still remember in northern part of Malaysia, the word insan, we use orang. Okay, when you send your kids to this teacher, say, jadikan dia orang. And what do you mean here by orang is insan? Okay. With that, I open to you, ladies and gentlemen, question to both of the presenters.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Sohaimi. Thank you to both speakers. I think what has been presented will surely, in some aspects or many aspects, will jolt our mind and to keep thinking where, as a Muslim and as a religion Islam, where it's heading to in facing future challenges. So I think if we can pick up from what has been said and we thought about it, I think we could get some simple answers to it. Now, my first question is directed to Imam Feisal. Well, I would like to view you as somebody who is moderate, and in fact, you do portray yourself as a moderate Muslim. But then when you compare that with what you have said in the later part of your presentation about mu'min, there's always that idea of orthodoxy. You know, because you ask yourself, if I want to mu'min, I have to really stick to what has been practiced by Rasulullah. Now there's no two ways about it. I mean your heart tells about it. No, I'm a mu'min, I have got to stick. And that's what our ulama, our ustad has been saying here. Unless they are saying something else, they are being more moderate, then it's easy for our heart and soul to accept, to be a real mu'min in that sense. Again, so there is a kind of a contradictory between to be a moderate Muslim and a real mu'min, because the mu'min there is defined as the way it's being defined, being very orthodox. So that is kind of my question. At the end, I suppose it's up to individual how you want to define or how do you want to be or to be deemed as mu'min.
Okay, thank you for that question. First of all, the word moderate in English is a bad word because it tends to suggest that you are not orthodox, or it tends to suggest that you are not, doing everything that you're supposed to do properly, and that's not what was meant by it. What is meant by it is best described by a hadith, one of my favorite hadiths, in which 3 young men came to ask the wives of the Prophet about his practice. You know this hadith, many of you know from the hadith. And one of them said, oh, well, gee, the Prophet had his past and future sins forgiven, as Allah says in Surah Al-Fath. We are different. So one of them said, I will fast every day for the rest of my life. And the other one says, I will stay up every night doing qiyam, every night, all night. And the third one says, I will be celibate and never get married. And so the Prophet overhears them, comes and says, are you the guys who said that? And he was quite upset with them. And he said, look, none of you knows Allah better than I do, nor do you love Allah better than I. And I don't go that far. Okay, I sometimes do nawafil, extra fasting, and sometimes I don't. I do qiyam al-layl, and sometimes I don't. And I marry. And whoever does not follow my sunnah, laysa minni, is not of my community. This is what I mean by not being extremist. There's a tendency for people, an analogy I give is like when I first learned how to cook. Okay, put a little bit of spice, it makes it so tasty. So you think the more spice you put, the better it becomes. All right? The excellence of cooking is knowing when to stop, is knowing when the perfect balance is achieved. And our religion is our religion. Allah tells in Surah Al-Hujurat to the people, لا تمنوا علي إسلامكم. Do not favor me with your Islam. What does your Islam here mean? Of course, it means your practice of Islam. But it can mean more than that. My Islam and your Islam, Dr. Kamali's Islam, and our Islam here, has something of us unique in it. So it is common, yet it is unique and different. It's like saying, okay, you make chicken korma, and you make chicken korma, and I make chicken korma. Your chicken korma, and your chicken korma. It's all chicken korma, but your chicken korma is my favorite. Or your chicken korma tastes fantastic. It's all chicken korma, but your chicken korma is something else. So, لا تمنوا علي إسلامكم. Don't favor me with your Islam. I don't like the taste of your chicken korma, Allah is telling these people. It doesn't taste good. We all know, I love chicken korma, but people can destroy it, can do it so badly. So, I use this analogy to say, how do you prepare, how do you cook your Islam so it's the tastiest Islam? That requires care in your recipe, in your cooking, in your preparation. We've all prayed and said, this is a lousy prayer, Faisal. And we've all had a prayer that that was a good prayer. We've all had this experience. How do we make sure that our prayers are better? That's the training that we try to give. So, for instance, I often ask my audiences, my Muslim audiences, you pray 2 rakats of subuh exactly the way Rasulullah did it. Same movements, same ayat recitation, same everything. Is the pahala you get the same as the pahala of Rasulullah? Show of hands. How many say the reward you get is the same as Rasulullah's reward? Or the value of your 2 rakats is the same as Rasulullah's? Nobody wants to, Tabrani, to show your hands? Usually, in America, we are not as shy as the Malays. Okay, by a vote of 70 to 75% say it's not the same. About 5-10% say it should be the same. And the rest are confused and not knowing how to, still processing the question. So I said, well, by the majority, you say it's not the same. Why not? Is the next question. The question of that, how do you make the distance between your 2 rakats and the Prophet's rakats less different? How do you lessen the distance, the gap between the quality of your salah and the Prophet's salah? Can you exercise? Can you find some way of doing some, latihan salat or something like that, some exercise, just like you train yourself to become a better cook, to become a better chef. How do you train yourself to be a better practitioner of your faith so that Allah accepts my Islam? My chicken korma is just, everybody's crazy over it. That's the question. That's the way we approach this issue of how do you practice your faith and how do you teach it to people. So in my sermons, for example, I do this. I once had an inspiration because I read somewhere that, I don't think it was a hadith, although I remember first thing there's a hadith that the salah is the mi'raj of the mu'min. So I said, okay, the salah is the mi'raj of the mu'min. Let me try and practice this. I said, let me do what Ibn Arabi says, an act of creative imagination, and let's imagine that I am actually doing the mi'raj with the Prophet. I read all the hadith of the Prophet about the mi'raj, and then how when the Prophet, was in the first level of heaven, or he saw all the angels standing, the next level, the angels were bowing, the third level of heaven, the angels in prostration, and imagining myself with every movement of the rak'ah I was going with and watching the angels. I couldn't finish 2 rak'ats. The first time I did that. It was so intense. But it's this kind of exercises that helps train and discipline the soul so that you know that you're actually progressing. When you go to school, you know that you're in Form 2, you're in Form 5, you're in first year university, in graduate university. You can see the progress and development in your intellectual maturity. Do we feel that we are maturing in terms of our religiosity, of our spiritual practice? That I have a more mature spiritual practice, a more mature soul, that I feel closer to Rasulullah, that I have a meaning to what I'm saying when I say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu Muhammad Rasulullah. My prayer, my fasting, my experience of Ramadan. Every Ramadan has a different flavor. The Prophet said, seek Laylatul Qadr. When I was 20 years old, I said, okay, Laylatul Qadr is better than Alf Shahr, better than 1,000 months. You calculate how many, 83 years, whatever. Okay, I stay up all night expecting what a friend of mine calls an MGM special, right? Trumpets blaring, angels coming down. Nothing happened. What's wrong? God says this is 27th of Ramadan. This is Laylatul Qadr. What happened? Why don't I feel anything? I read the hadith, the Prophet says, seek Laylatul Qadr. Look for Laylatul Qadr in the last 10 days of Ramadan. I looked for it, couldn't find it. And I read the hadith, and then the Prophet says, some of his companions experienced Laylatul Qadr at the beginning of Ramadan. I said, that was new. That's in Sahih Bukhari. So I discovered you can experience Laylatul Qadr anytime. So how does Laylatul Qadr to be experienced? How do you teach people to taste that? The Prophet taught his companions to do that. I want to taste it too. If I don't taste Laylatul Qadr, I don't think my Islam is complete. I don't think so. You may be happy. Khalas, that's your Islam. But for me, my Islam, I'm not satisfied if I haven't tasted Laylatul Qadr. And then once I taste it, how do I teach it? How do you enable people to get the experience of it? You can only teach what you know. If you don't know something, you're like Loya Buro, as they say in Malay. You're just BSing. You're just talking around the subject because you haven't really tasted it. You have only when you know something can you really teach it. So we started a school, a Sunday school, to teach this to our children. And I've discovered that to teach it, you don't only have to teach the challenge of the curriculum to teach the children, you also have to, we need a teachers' college to teach the teachers how to teach this. And in the same process, after introducing this program to our parents who have a long waiting list, the parents also want to learn it. So we have now multiplied the expanded scope of the demand of our, to use market language, the market demand for our product is very strong. But the ability to train and to teach the people who can therefore teach others that is where the weak link is, and where we need additional resources and help. But that is the need of the time right now.
For this panel, I just want to ask about, you talk about the minorities and their narratives in each country. By all measures, when we look at the Muslim country, they are at the lowest ranking in economic and by all measures of some of the studies done on Islamic values. Even in individual, like in US, how does a Muslim, adapt to different culture? Probably even in Malaysia, the Muslim are left behind by all measures in terms of economic terms. So we feel that we are losing the competitiveness, and is it because of the way we educate our children that they are not able to navigate the more complex and competitive world? How does you find a Mukming or the Ehsan, all these three principles to adapt in this new economic landscape? And your example, your experience in US or in other countries, how do they cope with this? Embedded into those cultures, we tend to be isolated sometimes when we are minorities, having our own communities, but not embedded in the whole nation building.
Thank you for your question. Historically, minorities tend to be more successful than the host community. This is a general feature of history, because the tendency for those who emigrated, basically emigrated because they want to make a better life for themselves. They tend to be harder working. So the Muslims who have immigrated to the United States, for example, tend to be among the most highly educated in the United States, professional, successful, graduates of top universities. If you look at the Muslim demographic in the United States, we are among the most highly educated segment of the United States in terms of college degrees, postgraduate degrees, earning capacity, and so forth. In fact, there's a joke that the Pakistani expatriates' annual income equals the GDP of Pakistan itself. But this is true of all communities. I mean, immigrants who are from Mexico, they are working hard. They're working harder. That's one strand of the comment regarding your comment. The plight of the Muslim world has has several factors to it in my assessment and judgment. One factor can be attributed to the fact that we have lost the deeper understanding of our faith, what I call the excessive attachment to Islam and forgetting Iman and Ihsan as part of the fundamental impulse of all religion, and we tend to think. In fact, one of the things that I've also written another book that's not yet published, called on what I'm saying, the need to invert our perspective from an earth-centric perspective to a God-centric perspective. You see, we tend to look at Islam and Judaism and Christianity and so forth, whereas if we look at it from God's perspective, it's Dinillah, which Allah calls Dinillah, Din al-Haq, Din al-Qayyim, Din al-Qayyimah, Din al-Fitra. So what we need to do actually is to invert our perspective and look at all of life and everything from a God perspective rather than from an earth ego perspective. But part of what has happened in our history is the forgetting of Iman and Ihsan, and you find people who are very professional Muslims, as I call them, and having hardly any Iman, and you don't see any Ihsan in their behavior or their ethics, which is essential. But this is as far as the religious component of what has held back the development of the Muslim Ummah. The other aspect has to do with some factors which I believe were instrumental in the success of the West. The West succeeded, as I see it, because of two very powerful concepts. One was the creation of the corporation as an artificial person. Second, the concept of a little amount of interest as not being usurious, which led to the creation of banking, which then raised a lot of capital, and the corporation as a limited liability company, which limits the liability of the investor to only the money that he or she invested in the corporation. So it was the corporation, the chartered corporation, which actually resulted in colonialism. It was the East India Company, which at one time had more soldiers and more wealth than the British king himself had, than the government of England had. And the United States, all these companies, like the Hudson Bay Company, which actually developed the United States, the railroad companies, they raised a lot of capital. Some of them went bankrupt. But the idea of raising risk capital to invest in ideas that, if successful, would be wildly successful, and if they'd failed, would limit the liability to the investment of the entity of the enterprise itself. That was a very powerful concept, which led to the development of Northern Europe over the rest of Southern Europe and the rest of the world. So whereas in Islamic traditional thing, you had a partnership, and the debts of the partnership were your debts. You could not firewall them. So this is just a theory of mine, which is in terms of why we fell behind in the development of in terms of technological development. So it's this from a structural point of view, and also the nature of organization. Organization, administration is really key to it. If you look at Malaysia, Malaysia is more prosperous than Pakistan or than Egypt. Well, Malays are not more intelligent than Egyptians or the Pakistanis. But why? Because the system is better system. So people, Egyptians come to Malaysia, they can be more successful than they can be in Egypt. They go to America to be more successful because the system is better. Well, it was the Protestants who started the idea. It was the Calvinistic doctrine which started the idea that little amount of interest is non-usurious, which led to Italy as being the center of banking at the time. I think Samuel Huntington's thesis on that issue has been disproven by the facts. The Protestants are a waning community in the United States. The Protestant ethic has disappeared in the United States. You look at the schools today. I was just sharing with our colleagues here, the freshman schools, the top schools in New York City. 70% of the population is Asian. Chinese, Indian, Korean, Bangladeshi, Japanese, and then maybe 100 are whites, of which a small percentage are Protestants. So when you look at it when you look at the trends which are happening right now in the United States, at the educational level, for example, even at the population level, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant demographic in the United States is shrinking. It is disappearing. Demographic trends show that by before 2050, there'll be a minority in the United States. And yet the United States is still continuing because of the structural, the systemic things that were introduced. They happened to be introduced by Protestants at that time. It's like saying algebra is part of Islamic science. Well, it was Muslims who created algebra. But algebra is not something peculiarly Islamic. There's nothing Quranic, or it's not something, it doesn't come from our theology. It happened to be Muslims who created logarithms. Al-Khwarizmi created logarithms. Algebra was created by the Arabs. But it doesn't mean that it is something to do with our theology that brought logarithms or algebra. The genius of the human being is a genius, whoever, an atheist can come up with that. So the same thing, the systemic constructs, what something failed to recognize is the role of the corporate entity and the role of banking in creating risk capital and in the growth and evolution of the banking industry as a totally new thing which did not exist 2 centuries ago, because it multiplied the money supply. And the nature of money has shifted. It's no longer a commodity. And the understanding of what money means is essential to enabling the availability of capital, the availability of capital to fund business enterprises and to fund an economy. And the management of the economic fundamentals. This is a science in itself. But essential to the growth of the economy has been the address of the issue of this issue of riba. And it is this issue of riba which held back the Muslims and the Catholics. And it was the Protestants who invented the notion of Calvin, actually was the one, John Calvin, who introduced the idea of a little amount of interest being non-usurious, that made it halal. And this made, what was it? It was that big town in Italy, I forget now, which made it the capital of the banking industry back in the Middle Ages.
Okay, thank you. I suppose that will be the last questions. I think on behalf of us, we would like to thank Imam Feisal in particular, and of course, Tuan Rumah, Prof. Kamali. And before we end our session for our Zuhr prayer, I would like to invite Prof. Kamali to give a token of appreciation to Imam Feisal.
Thank you very much, Professor Hashim. Thank you, sir. Thank you. My pleasure, indeed, an honor. Terima kasih banyak. Thank you so much. God bless you all. Thank you, sir.